welcome. Thank you for coming to my talk. As Danny mentioned, I'm the project lead and co-founder of Connext. This talk is about the Connext contributor program. I'm going to be going into what that is. And I'm also going to lie to you a bunch in this talk, and I'm going to explain why I'm lying to you. And hopefully, through those lies, you can learn a bit more about Connext and what we're trying to do with this program. So recently, we announced our first network hard fork, Amrock. I'm going to give some background on what that is. But the core idea behind this network hard fork was, let's find ways to understand the trade-off space and mitigate the trade-off space around bridges. So for the last year, we've been talking about this really interesting trade-off set that exists around bridges called the Interoperability Trilemma that very closely maps to the scalability trilemma in blockchains. And that is that it is really difficult to build a bridge or cross-chain communication mechanism that is simultaneously trust minimized. Obviously, that is important. Generalizable, which means being able to send any kind of arbitrary message across chains. And extensible, which means being able to deploy this thing onto a bunch of different kinds of chains, rollups, other kinds of domains, without really having to do too much additional work. Without having to spend, months and months of development work having to build custom implementations for a specific chain. Now, over the course of the last year, we've actually expanded our understanding of this trilemma, and now it's a quadrilemma, because we've discovered this new mechanism, optimistic bridges, which has been kind of put forward by the Nomad team, where instead of having some set of validators relaying data across chains, or having an atomic swap, or having something like IBC, you instead have used the optimistic fraud-proof model, kind of, which most people associate with optimistic rollups these days, to push data across chains, and in this case, take the trade-off of latency. I'm going to kind of give a more high-level overview of this, just because this is a little bit more background info, and I definitely still have a lot of slides to get through, but I'm happy to kind of chat about this afterwards, and we will be having a session later today about optimistic bridges as well. So, trade-off, in this case, is latency. And unfortunately, this brings us to the same slide as before, which is that there are always trade-offs. This is the unfortunate nature of distributed systems, is that you can't really get around this trade-off space. You always have to find some way to trade off something that you're willing to accept for yourself or for your user experience. Is there a way to end up with a better trade-off space? And we've talked about kind of big M modularity today already. And at the moment, our best hypothesis around how to deal with trade-offs in distributed systems is to modularize those systems, stack them on top of each other, separate out the concerns, and hopefully these things can overlap in a way where you're able to mitigate these trade-offs. So for the modular blockchain thesis, this is separate out data availability, separate out execution and settlement, and have those three things happening through different mechanisms, for instance, using Celestia for data availability, rollups for execution, and then Ethereum as your base layer. In the case of bridging, we can kind of do the same thing. You can have a transport layer that is responsible for relaying data across chains. This is just basic off-chain infrastructure. Really, this is a combination of indexing the chain, through things like the graph, and then relaying that data and ensuring delivery of that data through relayer networks like Keeper, Gelato, etc. And then on top of that, you can have a messaging layer. So IBC is an example of a messaging layer, or at least it's a framework around which you can build messaging layers. But then also that includes Nomad, that includes rollup bridges, that includes XCMP. And of course, the goal is to have a messaging layer that is trust minimized. And then some sort of gateway layer to figure out which messaging layer you should go to, and then Connext, which would, in this case, sit on top of everything and provide liquidity. How do you actually get the asset that you want to get on a chain when you want to get it? Now, this is all kind of high-level overview, but the idea behind this is, let's break out the specific things that we care about when we're bridging into smaller, easier-to-solve problems, and let's layer them on top of each other in a new flow that actually utilizes some of the other interop systems out there, like Nomad, to simplify the experience for developers and to end up in a world where we do actually have fast executions across chains, but with trust minimized and generalized message passing. So in our case, what we've proposed with our network hard fork is call into Connext, use Nomad for passing proofs across chains, and then Connext sort of short circuits the Nomad flow, executes the whatever you want to do on the destination chain faster, and then takes on the risk as a network of making that happen. Cool. How does Connext do this? So, sorry, jumping back. Connext is made up of a network of nodes called routers. Connext routers basically watch Nomad transactions that go across chains, and they race to execute them faster than Nomad would execute them, which, as I mentioned earlier, takes a latency of about 30 minutes. How do they race? Well, of course, it's kind of bad if they're actually racing each other to do this. So instead, we have something called a sequencer, similar to a rollup sequencer, that aggregates all of the transactions coming from Connext routers and posts them to chain. And the important thing is that it does this fairly. So how does it do this fairly? In our announcement so far, and in our conversations about our AMROC, and in our conversations about our network upgrade overall, we've largely talked about this process happening fairly, but we haven't ever delved into what that means. And the reason for that is that it's actually kind of a hard topic, and it makes us sound smarter if we don't delve into it. And also because it's a really, really difficult problem. Fair execution of transactions, fair sequencing of transactions is a problem that's shared with rollups as well. And figuring out how to make it happen so that someone can take a bunch of unordered transactions, fairly order them, put them to chain, requires external incentive mechanisms that we just haven't really developed yet. The other thing that we've kind of left out is like, okay, well, what happens if people just don't do it? What happens if the nodes of Connext, people who are running nodes in Connext just don't go through this process at all? What if they just don't submit transactions to a sequencer, and they just front run the entire network and submit transactions to chain? This is another thing that we've sort of glossed over, and we're ignoring because it's kind of inconvenient. Now, these are the two lies that I've told so far in this presentation, and the two lies that we've generally told over the course of our announcement with AMROC, because we didn't want to really go into depth about why it is that these problems exist and what we can do about them. And this brings me to the third lie, which is the topic of this talk, which is that this isn't a technical talk, and this is why I've been trying to gloss over a lot of the details of this. This isn't a talk. I mean, of course, we'll be going into what the contributor program is, but really, this talk is a token announcement. Cool. So we're introducing Next, which is the Connext Network token. This has been a long time coming. It makes sense that we've had to lie about some of the core mechanisms within the network so far, because we haven't really been able to explain our model for this until one, we were sure about how it would work, and two, we were sure that we could kind of do so legally. But getting into why this makes sense, there are mechanisms that we can use to enforce fair execution. There are mechanisms that we can use to make sure that service providers within a network are fairly participating in that network. And the good thing is that these mechanisms are fairly well established. So similar to other types of utility tokens that power fair utilization in the graph or in live peer, the Connext network token powers fair utilization in Connext. We have our network of nodes stake within the network. They earn fees proportional to what they've staked. And in fact, they don't just earn fees, they actually earn work proportional to what they've staked. So a certain amount of transactions would get passed onto a router based on the amount of money that they have within the network. And similarly, sequencers stake. We can prove that sequencers are ordering transactions done fairly by basically enforcing that they are slashed if they don't do so. As long as there's a deterministic mechanism to actually order these transactions, and as long as you have data availability of what the transactions are, these are, again, two assumptions, but these are things that are beatable assumptions, we can actually enforce that Connext sequencers are fairly ordering transactions. We can enforce that this entire system stays stable, where it is not possible for routers to kind of front run the entire network and get more, basically relay packets of data, earn fees from users without having to go through this process. Other details about the token, when, probably the most important question for everybody. 1 to 2 months is what we're thinking. The token itself is not yet live. We're pre-announcing it at the moment because we want to be able to talk about the ways that people can get it. We have taken snapshots already, so don't try to get it by putting a lot of volume through our system, but definitely do try to put volume through our system. And then in addition to that, in addition to their, its existing mechanisms around the utility of the network, we're also interested in starting a DAO. And I think we as a community feel extremely strongly that community-oriented resource allocation is really the most effective long-term mechanism for resource allocation. And this kind of gets me to the last and most important piece of this actual talk and this announcement, which is the Connext contributor program. So there are no ways to get tokens anymore as a result of trying to participate in the network, because we have taken snapshots and we're doing airdrops to the existing participants. However, we want to pioneer a new model to actually drive community action. And this is the reason that we're announcing the token itself today rather than actually just launching it. We think that there are really, really powerful ways to empower members of a community and give them leadership roles, give them ownership over the ecosystem prior to a token launch. And I think this is really what can help decentralize these ecosystems far before we get to the actual token being live and a DAO making decisions unilaterally for a bunch of people who don't necessarily know what's going on. So the Connext contributor program is a program that we are starting today. The phase 1 of the program runs until the token launches. And the idea with the program is to encourage people to take leadership positions within the community. Similar to the Graphs Curator program and a couple of other programs that have been created so far, we plan to find ways to reward, or at least we as a collective community want to find ways to reward the people that are getting involved early and stewarding some of the key roles within our community. The contributor program is split up into 5 tracks. We've kind of thought long and hard about how we wanted to structure this, and what we realized was there are really different kinds of ways that people participate in our community today. And in many of these cases, there are actually existing organizations that have sprung up kind of grassroots within our ecosystem. So for instance, there is the community leaders track, and what this is basically based off of an existing initiative that kind of happened organically within our Discord, where people just started asking to be moderators and ambassadors, and it became this kind of self-regulating, self-organizing piece of infrastructure that now does support. Stewards the ecosystem in a bunch of different ways, runs localized communities in, I think, 15 to 16 different countries. The program is made up of 50 people now. It's kind of crazy. We plan to grow it to several hundred people pretty soon. Same thing goes for the other contributor tracks. So builders, of course, are people that build on top of Connext. They're the people that drive volume to the ecosystem, but also people who advocate for building on top of Connext, going and giving presentations in front of developers, teaching people how they can actually utilize this network to do really, really interesting things that you couldn't do before. Educators give high-level information about the way that bridges work. There's still such a giant information gap. I know, like I said, I have had to in the interest of time, gloss over a lot of the details of how bridges work in this talk. But I think a lot of the role of educators within our community is to try to give more information about how those things how those things do work today and how they could work in the future. Routers in our network run the network, as we've talked about before. And lastly, we don't think that we can come up within a closed room environment all of the different ways in which you could contribute. So we have a last catch-all category of grantees. So if people have different ways to add to the ecosystem that we haven't thought of with one of these roles, applying for grants is an alternative. The goal of this contributor program is have community leaders operate it entirely, have them design the community points mechanism, have them design a way to reward contributors, and at the end, we will take basically what they say and give it to the DAO and ask the DAO to retroactively grant tokens to the people that participated. I think this is powerful because one of the key goals is to remove ourselves from the equation, to end up in a world where the community is running itself, and so running this program is the first really powerful step towards doing that. How can you join? So this is now live. with another asterisk, which is that it's not live for US people. But it is possible for people to start contributing today. And I think there's a lot of really interesting ways that people can get involved, even by just doing relatively basic things like learning about bridges and posting about it, learning about how to build on top of Connext and writing a guide. If you're already a person that is interested in running infrastructure, running a router. And I think over the course of this program, a lot of those things kind of bifurcate into some of the existing things that you see with like other decentralized networks, like an incentivized testnet. Cool. This was a fast talk, and I know that I had a lot that I went through really, really quickly. So I do want to leave some time for questions, but regardless, thank you for coming.